The plate hit the table with a sound like a gunshot, and Eliza Fletcher's hands were shaking so badly she had to press them flat against the rough-hewn wood to keep herself upright. "I told you," she said, and her voice came out low and cracked at the edges, the way a drought-split earth sounds when it finally gets rain it cannot hold. "I told you before you ever sat down at this table that I could not cook anything worth eating. I said those exact words to you, Vernon Maddox, and you said it did not matter. You said you would eat it anyway." She lifted her eyes to his, and there was something wild living in them, something wounded and furious all at once, the way a cornered animal looks before it decides whether to fight or surrender. "So do not sit there with that face. Do not you dare sit there with that face and make me feel like I have failed you." Vernon Maddox did not move. He was a large man, broad across the shoulders in a way that had nothing to do with vanity, and everything to do with years of working land that did not want to be worked. His hands rested on either side of the tin plate, and on that plate sat something that had once aspired to be beef stew, but had clearly lost the argument somewhere around the second hour of cooking. The meat was the color of old saddle leather. The potatoes had dissolved into a gray paste that smelled faintly of regret. There was a biscuit balanced on the rim of the plate that appeared to have been baked in the fires of something deeply unfortunate. He looked at the plate. He looked at her. The lantern light between them threw shadows across the hard lines of his jaw, across the scar that ran from the corner of his left eye down to his cheekbone, across the careful, deliberate stillness that was the most dangerous thing about Vernon Maddox, because when still men finally moved, they moved with everything they had. He picked up his fork. Eliza Fletcher let out a breath that sounded like a woman being set free from a very small prison. "I meant it then," Vernon said, and he cut through the gray paste with the side of his fork as if it were the most ordinary thing in the world. "I mean it now." He lifted a piece of the disintegrated potato to his mouth. He chewed. His expression did not change, "And I will mean it tomorrow morning when you try to make breakfast." She sat down very slowly in the chair across from him, as if her legs had just remembered they were tired. "You are a stubborn, impossible man," she said. "Yes," he agreed, and he reached for the biscuit. But it had not always been this kitchen, this table, this lantern light. It had not always been the two of them sitting across from each other, in the kind of silence that holds more words than any conversation ever managed. To understand how Eliza Fletcher came to stand trembling over a plate of ruined stew in the New Mexico Territory in the spring of 1878, and how Vernon Maddox came to be the man who picked up his fork anyway, you had to go back to the advertisement. You had to go back to the letter. You had to go back to the beginning of a story that neither of them had intended to write. The advertisement appeared in the Kansas City Daily Journal in the first week of February 1878, placed there by a man named Gerald Hollis on behalf of his neighbor, and it read in the plain-spoken way of the frontier: "Cattleman, 31 years, established ranch outside Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, seeks wife of good character and honest disposition. Woman of any reasonable background considered. Write to V. Maddox, care of the Cimarron Post Office." Vernon had not written that advertisement himself. He had dictated it to Gerald Hollis on a Tuesday afternoon in January while fixing a section of fence, and Gerald had taken considerable creative liberty with the final product, adding the phrase "good character" because he felt it sounded respectable, and "honest disposition" because he thought Vernon needed a woman who would tell him the truth. Vernon had not read the final version before Gerald sent it because Vernon's reading was slow and laborious, a fact he kept as close to his chest as a hidden card, a secret that lived in the dark place behind his eyes and came out only in the moments when someone handed him a bill of sale or a letter and expected him to read it aloud without hesitation. The letter from Eliza Fletcher arrived 6 weeks later, and Gerald Hollis read it to Vernon while they sat on the porch of the Hollis homestead, Gerald squinting at the neat, careful handwriting, and Vernon sitting with his hat in his hands and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, listening to someone else's words describe a life he had never considered. She was 24 years old. She lived in St. Louis, Missouri, in a boarding house for women run by a widow named Mrs. Anstruther, and she had been living there for 2 years following the death of her mother, and the subsequent revelation that her father had left behind debts significant enough to consume every piece of property the Fletcher family had ever owned. She was a seamstress by trade, competent with her hands and thorough in her work, though she confessed with a candor that Gerald Hollis found both surprising and endearing that she had no talent for cooking, no patience for it, no instinct for it, and no history of success at it. She had burned 3 separate meals in the week before writing this letter alone. She did not offer this information as an apology. She offered it as a fact, the way a person laying out the terms of a negotiation puts all their cards on the table before the deal is struck. She had other qualities, the letter went on. She was strong. She had buried her mother without falling to pieces. She had worked every day since without complaint. She was not afraid of hard weather or hard work. She was afraid of snakes, she admitted, but she was working on this. She thought the West might suit her. She thought open land might feel like breathing after years of the city's closed, smoke-filled rooms. She was not looking for romance, she wrote, with a directness that made Gerald Hollis pause and look over his spectacles at Vernon. She was looking for a partnership with a man who was honest about his own limitations so that she might be honest about hers. Vernon had sat very still through the reading of that letter. When Gerald finished, he folded the pages and held them out. Vernon did not take them. He looked at them for a moment, then looked back at the middle distance. "Write back to her," he said. "What do you want me to say?" Vernon thought about this for a long time, long enough that a crow landed on the fence post at the edge of the yard and sat there judging them both. "Tell her she can come," he said. "Tell her the cooking does not matter. Tell her I will eat it anyway." Gerald Hollis stared at him. "Those are the strangest words of courtship I have ever been asked to write." "Write them anyway," Vernon said. So Gerald wrote them, and the letter went back to St. Louis, and Eliza Fletcher read it in her small room at Mrs. Anstruther's boarding house on a Tuesday evening with the window open to the smell of the Mississippi River and the sound of the city going about its loud and indifferent business. She read it 3 times. The 3rd time, she pressed the letter flat against her knee and sat looking at the wall for several minutes, and then she began to cry, not from sadness but from something she had no accurate word for. Some vast, complicated relief that a man she had never met had read her most embarrassing confession, and responded not with polite dismissal, but with the simplest, most absolute acceptance she had ever received in her 24 years of life. She wrote back the following morning to say she would come. The journey from St. Louis to Cimarron, New Mexico Territory, in March of 1878 was not a journey undertaken lightly or in comfort. Eliza had been on trains before, short excursions for work purposes, but nothing that prepared her for 3 days aboard the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe Railway, sitting upright in the wooden seat of a second-class car with her 2 bags wedged beneath her feet, and the world outside the window transforming itself from the familiar greens and grays of Missouri into something vast and tawny and relentless that she did not have a name for. Kansas went by. The land flattened out until the sky was everything, pressing down from above with a weight that was not oppressive but enormous, a kind of enormity that made Eliza feel simultaneously smaller and more real than she had in years. At Springer, New Mexico, she transferred to a stage that rattled and lurched its way the remaining distance towards Cimarron, and she spent the last 2 hours of the journey pressed between a hardware merchant from Denver and a Jesuit priest, who seemed to be praying in a continuous low murmur against the violent motion of the coach. The Cimarron Valley opened up around them as the stage descended from the higher ground, and Eliza pressed her face to the window and saw it for the first time. The big mountains to the west and north still holding their winter snow, the Cimarron River below catching the late afternoon light, the small, tight cluster of the town itself with its handful of adobe and wooden buildings tucked into the land as if hoping not to be noticed. She was afraid. She did not permit herself to be afraid for very long because she had found, in the 2 years since her mother died, that fear was a luxury she could not consistently afford. But for the length of one full breath as the stage pulled into the yard of the St. James Hotel, she allowed herself to feel it completely, the cold hollow understanding that she had crossed half a continent to marry a man whose face she had never seen, a man who knew her most humiliating truth and had replied with a sentence that might have been kindness or might have been something else entirely. Then the stage door opened, and Vernon Maddox was standing there. He was not what she had imagined, though she could not have said precisely what she had imagined because she had forbidden herself from imagining anything specific, preferring the protection of blankness to the disappointment of expectation. He was taller than the other men in the yard by several inches, and broader, with the kind of physical presence that announced itself without effort, the way a large rock in a river announces itself by the way the water moves around it. He had dark hair gone slightly long past the collar of his coat, and dark eyes that were doing something she had not expected, which was looking at her with a concentration that did not feel predatory but rather careful, the way a man looks at something he intends to understand. He had the scar, which the letter had not mentioned. She noted it without alarm and filed it away. He reached up and took his hat off when she stepped down from the stage, a gesture so old-fashioned and courteous that she nearly laughed, and then she did not laugh because she could see that it was entirely sincere. He did not offer his hand. He stood at a respectful distance, giving her room. "Miss Fletcher," he said. "Mr. Maddox," she said. They looked at each other across the space of 3 feet and the space of everything they did not know yet. "The hotel will have supper ready," he said. "I thought we might eat before we go to the magistrate if that suits you." "That suits me," she said, and picked up her bags before he could reach for them, which made something shift briefly in his expression, something that was not quite a smile but was adjacent to one. They ate at the St. James Hotel, which in 1878 was already becoming one of the more storied establishments in the New Mexico Territory, a place where cattlemen and gamblers and railroad men and occasional outlaws moved through with the cheerful democratic indifference of frontier commerce. Eliza ate beef and bread and drank coffee that was strong enough to cause a physical reaction, and she watched Vernon Maddox across the table and tried to read him the way she would read the terms of a contract. He ate without ceremony. He listened when she spoke, which she had not expected, because in her experience men of the frontier variety tended to speak over women rather than at them. He asked questions and waited for the answers. He had a quality of patience that felt deliberate, like a skill he had worked to acquire, and she found herself wondering what kind of impatience it had been cultivated to contain. He told her about the ranch, 430 acres in the Cimarron Valley, built up over 6 years from a land claim he had staked at the age of 25 with almost nothing to his name and a fair amount of stubbornness. He ran cattle primarily, with a small herd of horses. He had a house that was plain and needed work. He had a man named Tobias Reyes who helped with the cattle and lived in a small structure near the barn with his wife, Maria, and their 2 children. He said all of this plainly, without embellishment, the way a man describes an asset he values honestly. He did not tell her about the reading. She noticed, only later, that she had done all the reading at supper, reading the menu aloud as if narrating to herself, and that when the bill came he had folded it and put it in his coat pocket without looking at it. She filed this away too, next to the scar, in the growing collection of observations she was building. They were married at 7 in the evening by a justice of the peace named Wallace, who appeared to be conducting the ceremony primarily to avoid missing the card game he had been interrupted from. It took 6 minutes. Vernon placed a plain gold ring on her finger with the serious attention of a man completing an important transaction, and when Wallace pronounced them married and told Vernon he could kiss his bride, there was a pause of approximately 3 seconds during which Eliza watched Vernon calculate the situation, and then he leaned down and pressed his lips briefly to her cheek, which she thought was both extraordinarily respectful and somehow rather sad. The kiss of a man who was being careful not to claim anything he had not yet been given. They drove to the ranch in the dark by wagon, the mountains showing themselves only as dark shapes against the stars, the road running along the river so that the sound of the water accompanied them for most of the journey. Vernon drove, and Eliza sat beside him with her bags at her feet, and they did not talk very much, but it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people who have agreed to something large and are giving it the respect of not covering it immediately with noise. The house, when they arrived, was lit from inside by the lamps that Tobias Ray's had left burning, and Eliza's first impression of it was that it was more substantial than she had feared. Adobe construction, thick walls, 2 rooms visible from the front, a covered porch running the full length of the front face. A kitchen garden had been started along the south wall and then apparently abandoned to its own devices, the winter-dry remains of what might have been beans or squash lying in tangles along the irrigation ditch. "It needs attention," Vernon said, looking at the garden. "So does everything worth having," Eliza said, and carried her bags inside. She did not attempt to cook anything that first night, which she took as a sign of native intelligence on her part. They ate bread and cold meat that Maria Ray's had left in the kitchen, and they drank water from the well, and they said good night with the formal politeness of strangers who have found themselves sharing a house through some complex set of circumstances, and intend to navigate this with dignity. Vernon gave her the bedroom without discussion, spreading his bedroll in the main room without apparent resentment, and Eliza lay in the unfamiliar dark and listened to the sounds of the New Mexico territory at night, the wind in the cottonwoods, the distant cry of something wild, the creak of the house settling around her, and thought about the word husband which now applied to the man sleeping in the next room, and found that it sat in her mind with a strange, provisional weight, not unpleasant, but not yet real. The first cooking disaster happened on the 4th day. She had tried beans. Beans seemed manageable. Beans were what people on the frontier ate when they were between other things, and they did not require technique so much as patience. She had soaked them the night before, as Maria had advised her in the careful, kind Spanish-accented English that had become one of Eliza's lifelines in those first days, and she had set them to boil in the morning. And then she had become thoroughly absorbed in the mending work she had set up in the main room, a large basket of Vernon's clothes that had clearly not been attended to in some time and required substantial intervention. The beans boiled dry, not merely dry. They calcified into something architectural at the bottom of the pot and emitted a smell that brought Vernon in from the yard at a rapid walk with his hand already raised toward the door. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the pot and looked at Eliza, who was standing over it with a wooden spoon and an expression that had moved well past dismay into a kind of grim philosophical territory. "I told you," she said. It was the first time she said it. It was not the last. "I told you in the letter." "You did," Vernon agreed. He came into the kitchen, took the pot carefully from the stove and carried it outside, where he set it in the yard to cool. He came back in, washed his hands, and stood looking at Eliza with that careful, reading expression she was coming to know. "We have salt pork," he said, "and Maria left corn bread from this morning." "I know how to make cold food," Eliza said, her voice carrying the precise tone of a woman who has been defeated and is choosing to acknowledge it without ceremony. "I am quite accomplished at cold food. I can arrange cold food on a plate with considerable skill." The corner of Vernon's mouth moved. "That is a useful talent. Do not patronize me." "I am not patronizing you," he said, and the sincerity in his voice was clear enough that she believed him. "I mean it. There is more cold food in this world than hot, and someone who can arrange it well is not nothing." She looked at him for a moment, this man she had married, standing in her kitchen in his work clothes with dried mud on his boots and something that was not quite amusement and not quite tenderness but possibly both together living in the corners of his dark eyes. "You are a very strange man," she said. Gerald Holly says the same thing, Vernon said. Fairly regularly. She made cold food. He ate it without complaint. She fixed his clothes, all 17 items in the basket, and when he came in that evening and found the mended pile on the end of the table, he stood looking at it for a moment before picking up his work shirt and running his thumb along the seam she had reinforced. "You are good at this," he said. "I told you I was," Eliza said. "You did," he said. "I believed you. That was the beginning of something." She could not have named it precisely in those early weeks, but it was there, building itself out of small materials, the way a nest is built from whatever the bird can carry. It was built from the mornings when she brought him coffee on the porch before he went out to the cattle, and he always took it with the same brief, sincere thank you, never perfunctory, always real. It was built from the evenings when he came in and told her about the land and the animals with the straightforward enthusiasm of a man describing the things he loved, as if he had been waiting for someone who might actually want to listen. It was built from the afternoon she found him at the kitchen table with a bill of sale in front of him and his jaw set in that particular way, and she sat down across from him without saying anything and read the document aloud in a matter-of-fact voice. And he listened, and when she finished, he looked at her across the table with an expression she could not immediately categorize, but which settled into her chest and stayed there. "Thank you," he said, and there was something in those two words that was not about the bill of sale at all. "The light is bad in here," she said. "We should get better lamps." "We should," he agreed, and neither of them said anything else about it. The cooking continued to be a source of genuine crisis. Eliza approached the kitchen the way a person approaches an enemy of unknown strength, with caution, with strategy, and with the steady knowledge that she was probably going to lose. She burned the biscuits on day 6. She oversalted the pork on day 8 in a manner that made the meat essentially non-navigable as food. She produced eggs on day 10 that had achieved a texture no egg had any business achieving. Each time she stood over the result and delivered her assessment in the same flat, factual voice. "This is not edible," or "This was supposed to be supper," or "I think we should not speak of this again." Each time, Vernon ate it. This was the thing she could not entirely account for. He did not eat it with the pained nobility of a martyr performing sacrifice. He did not eat it with elaborate false praise that would have been worse than criticism. He ate it the way he ate Maria's food, which was uniformly excellent, with steady, practical attention, as if the act of eating were simply what one did at mealtimes, and the quality of the food was a separate matter that need not interfere with the basic function. He occasionally paused. He occasionally looked at the plate with the brief, private expression of a man making a rapid internal adjustment, but he always kept going. "Why," Eliza said one evening in the 3rd week, watching him work his way through something that had been intended as a meat pie and had instead become a kind of heated archaeology of uncertain ingredients. "Why do you keep doing that?" He looked up. Eating what I make. You could go to Maria's every night. She would not mind. She has offered." "I know she has." "Then why?" Vernon set his fork down, which he rarely did, and looked at her across the table with the full attention he brought to important things. "Because you are my wife," he said, "and you work at this. Every day you work at it, and every day it is difficult for you, and if I go to Maria's for supper it tells you that your work is not worth eating, when what is actually true is that your work is always worth eating to me because you made it." Eliza stared at him. "That is not a logical position," she said. "No," he agreed and picked up his fork again. "It is not." She did not respond to this for a long moment, watching him eat the archaeology of uncertain ingredients with the same steady patience he brought to everything, and something happened in her chest that she did not fully examine until much later, a warm and complicated shifting, like ground that has been frozen all winter and is finally beginning to move. "It is also," she said carefully, "a remarkably kind position." "It is just how I feel about it," Vernon said. She got up and went to the window so that he would not see her face, and outside the night was coming down over the Cimarron Valley in its enormous, indifferent way, the stars beginning to appear one by one above the dark line of the mountains, and Eliza Fletcher stood at the window and understood, with the quiet certainty of a door opening, that she was in very serious trouble. She had not come to the New Mexico territory looking for love. She had said so in the letter, with a frankness she had meant completely. She had come for stability, for the clean simplicity of a practical arrangement between two honest people, for land and open air after the suffocating narrowness of St. Louis. She had not come to feel this slow, gathering warmth every time Vernon Maddox said her name, or to notice the particular way his hands moved when he was explaining something, or to spend mornings in the kitchen attempting dishes she knew she would fail at because the act of trying felt, for the first time in her life, like it was witnessed and valued, and that witnessing and valuing came from somewhere very specific in the house. From the man who went out to the cattle before dawn and came back covered in dust and said good morning like he meant it. This was a problem, she decided. It was a problem because she had no idea what he felt, beyond the practical kindness he extended to everyone, to her, to Tobias and Maria, to the horses. She had no evidence that his warmth toward her was anything other than the general decency of a decent man doing his level best by the arrangement they had made, and she had too much pride to mistake basic human courtesy for something more specific and risk the humiliation of being wrong. So she worked. She mended, she repaired. She sewed curtains for the windows and organized the house with the thorough, systematic attention of a woman who takes care of what she has been trusted with. And she continued to attempt the cooking, because she had decided on the fourth day that she was going to learn this if it killed her or the stove. And she ordered herself a copy of Mrs. Lincoln's Boston cookbook from the catalog at the dry goods store in Cimarron, which arrived in 3 weeks and represented the most hopeful document she had ever held in her hands. She read it cover to cover. Then she read it again. Then she attempted the beef stew, which was the dish that began this story and which serves now as the place where everything changed. She had followed the recipe. She had followed it with the painstaking attention of a woman who understands herself to have no native instinct and must therefore rely entirely on instruction. She had the beef, the potatoes, the onions, the carrots from Maria's garden, the salt, the pepper, the bit of flour for thickening. She had started it in the late morning to give it the long, slow time Mrs. Lincoln's Boston cookbook specified. She had checked it at the 1-hour mark and the 2-hour mark and the 3-hour mark, at each point congratulating herself on its progress, the rich color developing in the liquid, the way the kitchen was filling with a smell that for the first time actually resembled food. Then Gerald Hollies arrived. Gerald Hollies, Vernon's nearest neighbor and the man who had placed the advertisement that brought Eliza to New Mexico in the first place, was a sociable man who arrived without warning and stayed until forcibly removed by the demands of his own life. He appeared at the door in the middle of the afternoon with a bottle of rye whiskey and the news that a cattle buyer named Pearson was coming through Cimarron the following week and they needed to discuss their strategy. And Vernon said, "Come in, come in." And Eliza turned from the stove to greet him, and in the confusion of the visit and the conversation she forgot about the stew. She forgot about it for 45 minutes. When she went back to the kitchen, the beef had crossed the line from tender to something beyond tender, something that had lost its structural integrity entirely and merged with the potatoes, which had dissolved, and the whole thing had thickened to a paste that sat in the pot with the grim, finalistic authority of something that had given up hope of being anything recognizable. The biscuits she had put in the oven had gone from golden brown to a shade of brown that was several countries past golden. Gerald Hollies left before supper, which Eliza considered an act of either mercy or cowardice. And that was how she came to be standing at the kitchen table with a plate of gray paste and calcified biscuits, her hands pressed flat to the wood to keep them from shaking, saying "I told you," saying those exact words, looking at Vernon Maddox across the lantern light with all of her frustration and her hidden fear and her complicated feelings and her pride laid out between them as nakedly as the ruined supper. He picked up his fork. He meant it. He had always meant it. But something was different this time. Maybe it was the shaking hands, which she had not quite managed to hide. Maybe it was the way her voice had cracked in the middle of the sentence, the specific crack that is not about supper at all but about everything that supper has come to stand for. Maybe it was simply that Vernon Maddox was paying attention, which he always was, and this time what he saw in her face was not frustration, but something closer to grief. The quiet grief of a woman who has been trying very hard for a very long time and cannot tell if any of it matters. He set the fork down. "Eliza," he said. "Do not," she said quickly. "Do not make it into something it is not. It is only supper." "I know it is not supper you are talking about," he said, with the same quiet directness that characterized everything he said, the quality of language stripped down to its necessary bones. She stood very still. The lantern flame moved between them in the draft from the window. "What am I talking about then?" She asked, and she meant the question as a challenge, a way of retreating back into the safe territory of practicality, but it came out instead with a rawness she had not intended, a door left open that she had meant to keep shut. Vernon was quiet for a moment. Outside, one of the horses in the paddock made a sound, a soft, brief sound, and was quiet again. "You are asking if any of this matters to me," he said. "Beyond the practical arrangement, you are asking if you matter to me specifically, and you cannot bring yourself to ask it plainly because you are afraid of the answer." The silence was enormous. "You are very presumptuous," Eliza said, and her voice was hardly steady at all. "I have been told that too," Vernon said. He stood up from the table, which brought him to his full height in the small kitchen, and he walked around the table and stopped in front of her. And she did not back away because backing away was not in her nature. And they stood looking at each other in the lantern light with the ruined stew between them and everything else between them too. The 6 weeks of letters and the long journey and the 6-minute wedding, and the mornings with coffee on the porch, and the evenings with the bill of sale, and every plate of food she had ever put in front of him that he had eaten with the steady, unvarying intention of a man who has made a decision and will not be moved from it. "You matter to me," Vernon said, "not as a practical arrangement, you, specifically." Eliza looked at him for a long time. She looked at the scar and the dark eyes and the careful, patient face of a man who had built 430 acres of New Mexico land out of nothing but stubbornness and work. And she thought about the bill of sale on the kitchen table. And she understood, with the sudden clarity of something falling into place, that he had known, from the first evening at the St. James Hotel, that she would read it if he needed it read. He had recognized something in her from the very beginning, and she thought it was probably the same thing she had recognized in him, the quality of needing very little as long as what you had was real. "I am going to ruin breakfast tomorrow," she told him. "I know," he said. "I might ruin it worse than tonight." "That seems possible," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in that way, the way she had catalogued and filed and thought about more than she would ever confess. "Vernon," she said. "Eliza," he said, and then he did not kiss her on the cheek. She thought afterward that the moment she had felt most clearly what was happening between them was not when he kissed her but in the half-second before, when she saw his expression change from careful patience into something that had no patience in it whatsoever, something that was very simply and completely certain. It was the expression of a man who has been waiting long enough and has decided, with the same quiet finality he brought to every important decision, that the waiting is finished. The ruined stew sat on the table and went cold, and neither of them ate anything at all that night. Spring came to the Cimarron Valley with the specific and extravagant beauty of a land that spends its winters so stripped and bare that the eventual arrival of green is almost aggressive in its generosity. The cottonwoods along the river went yellow-green in the last week of April, and the meadow grass came up with a determination that Eliza found personally inspiring. and the kitchen garden that had been abandoned to the elements showed signs of revival that she chose to interpret as a metaphor. She and Vernon were learning each other in the way that people who have committed to something large learn it, which is to say not as a series of revelations, but as a series of accumulations, small and daily and building. She learned that he woke an hour before dawn every day without apparent effort or resentment, that this was not discipline so much as the natural rhythm of a man whose body had decided that dawn was when the important things began. She learned that he sang, very quietly, to the horses when he worked with them, old songs she did not recognize, half-remembered things from somewhere in his past that she had not yet asked about. She learned that he was funny in a dry, understated way that rewarded attention, that his humor lived in the single word rather than the long sentence, and that he deployed it precisely when she most needed it. He was learning her too. She could see it happening, could see him noting and filing the way she filed, building his understanding of her with the same methodical care he brought to understanding the land and the cattle. He learned that she read voraciously, and had brought 6 books with her from St. Louis, and had already ordered 3 more from the catalog at Hollis's store. He learned that she was stubborn in a way that was directional rather than reflexive, that she did not argue for the pleasure of arguing but would not yield on anything she had genuinely decided. He learned that her hands were always busy, that stillness was difficult for her, that she needed to be making or mending or tending something in order to feel she was not wasting the day. He started bringing home small problems for her, a bridle that needed repair, a section of canvas that needed new stitching, letters that needed reading. He brought them with a casualness that she understood immediately was not casual, that these were deliberate offerings, found work, created work, tasks he had designated as hers because he understood that having work was part of how she felt safe in the world. She accepted them with the same casualness, never acknowledging the intention, because the intention was something that lived between them without needing to be named, part of the accumulating vocabulary of a relationship being built in real time. Maria Reyes took Eliza into her kitchen in early May. This was not presented as a lesson, because Maria Reyes was too perceptive a woman to present anything as a lesson to someone as proud as Eliza. It was presented as company, which was something both women genuinely needed, as the nearest neighbor beyond the Hollies' place was 8 miles distant and female conversation in the Cimarron Valley was a scarcity on the order of water in August. They cooked together in Maria's kitchen, which was fragrant and ordered and full of the particular magic that some women's kitchens have, the magic of instinct accumulated over years and passed down through hands rather than words. Maria did not lecture. She cooked, and she talked about other things, about her children and the state of the vegetable garden and the temperament of the Hollies' new bull, which was apparently a matter of significant regional concern. And Eliza watched her hands and listened to the talk and began to understand, for the first time, that cooking was not a matter of following instructions, but a matter of paying attention to the thing in front of you, the way the oil moves in the pan, the way the smell changes when the flour begins to toast, the way the onion tells you it is ready. She came home from Maria's kitchen on the 3rd Thursday in May and made corn bread that was, by any honest assessment, edible. Not excellent, not something a person would celebrate, but edible in the full and genuine sense of the word, something that could be placed in the mouth and consumed without emotional consequences. She put it on the table at supper without comment, as if daring the world to notice. Vernon ate a piece. He put it down. He looked at it. He looked at her. He picked it up and ate the rest of it. "That," he said, "is corn bread." "Yes," Eliza said, "that is actual corn bread." "I am aware of what it is." He was quiet for a moment. "It is good, Eliza." She pressed her lips together against the ridiculous warmth rising in her chest. "It is adequate," she said. "Let us not overstate the case." "It is good," he said again, with the unhurrying certainty of a man who has said a thing and means it and sees no need to modify it. She ate her own piece and found, to her very great satisfaction, that he was right. It was good. Summer came, and with it the particular demands of the Cimarron Valley at full heat. The long days of work under a sky so deeply blue it seemed almost a different element from the pale, watery sky she had known in Missouri. Vernon was out from before dawn until the light failed, and Eliza found her days organizing themselves into a shape she had not anticipated, but which suited her. The mornings in the house and garden, the afternoons sometimes riding out to where the cattle work was happening, learning the land she now owned half of on paper and was coming to own entirely in her bones. She was not a natural writer. She told Vernon this, employing the same factual candor she had applied to her cooking, and he found her a horse that had no interest in drama and produced it with the same casual lack of ceremony he used for everything. The horse was named Clement, which was an unexciting name that suited an unexciting horse, and Eliza and Clement reached an accommodation within 2 weeks that was less thrilling and more functional than romance, but served the purpose entirely. She rode out to where Tobias Rays and Vernon were moving cattle across the south pasture on a Tuesday afternoon in late June, and she pulled Clement up at the fence and watched the work. The way the men and horses moved together around the cattle with the practiced, unhurried efficiency of people who understood what they were doing and had decided to understand it without waste or excess. Vernon looked up and saw her and raised one hand from the reins in acknowledgement, and she raised hers back, and she thought about the wedding at the St. James Hotel, the 6-minute ceremony and the polite kiss on the cheek, and she thought about the kitchen and the lantern light and what had come after, and she thought, with the mild amazement of a woman discovering something important about herself, that she was happy. This was a genuinely surprising finding. She had not been unhappy in St. Louis, or not consciously, but happiness had not been something she had bothered to look for. It had been a secondary consideration to the more pressing business of staying upright and solvent. Out here in this landscape that was still sometimes frightening in its scale and indifference, it had crept up on her in the form of work and honest words and a man who ate her cooking. She wanted to tell someone. She settled for Clement, who received the information with the philosophical calm of a horse that has heard worse. It was Gerald Hollies who brought the threat, though he did not know he was bringing it. He arrived in early July with the whiskey and the news, as was his custom, and this time the news was a man named Prescott Waverly, who had come to Cimarron with money from an Eastern investment group and an appetite for land, specifically the better grazing land in the valley, specifically the land that included Vernon Maddox's 430 acres, which sat on the river and had water rights that made it among the most valuable pieces of ground in the area. Waverly had, Gerald reported, been talking to people in town. He had been buying rounds at the saloon and asking questions, the kind of careful, investigative questions that a man asks when he is building a case rather than satisfying curiosity. He had hired a lawyer from Santa Fe who had set up an office temporarily in the back room of the dry goods store, and this lawyer had been looking at land records. Vernon sat very still through this recounting. "What is he looking for in the records?" he asked. Gerald shifted in his chair, which was a sign that the next part of the answer was not straightforward. "Your original land claim," he said, "the filing from 1872. There has been some question raised, apparently, about whether the boundaries were registered correctly." Vernon was quiet for a long moment. Eliza was in the main room, technically reading, actually listening through the half-open kitchen door. "The boundaries are correct," Vernon said. "I know that," Gerald said, "but there is a paperwork question, apparently, about the filing itself." He paused. "Vernon, the filing was done by you personally. You handled it yourself, the whole process. Do you have copies of the documents?" Another silence, longer this time. "I have them," Vernon said. "Have you looked at them recently?" "The specific language of the boundary description, the filing numbers, all of it." "Gerald," Vernon said, in a tone that ended that line of questioning. After Gerald left, Vernon went to the barn and was there for a long time. Eliza waited for him to come back to the house, and when he did not, she took the lamp and went out. He was in the stall with the bay mare, standing with one hand on her neck in the way he stood with the horses when he was thinking, and Eliza came in and hung the lamp on the post and sat down on the feed chest and waited. "The filing documents," she said after a while. "You want me to look at them?" He did not turn around. "Yes." "And the question Waverly's lawyer is raising." "I think I know what it is," Vernon said. "When I filed, there was a form, a description form that required very specific language about the water rights, the river boundary. I filled out what I was told to fill out." He paused. "I did not read it after." Eliza understood the shape of this. He had filled it out based on what someone had read to him or told him, and he could not go back and verify what he had actually written, because verifying it would require him to read it himself, which he had never been able to do, and admitting this was something he had not yet done aloud to anyone, including her. "Vernon," she said, "do not." His voice was tight, the first time she had ever heard it that way, the first time the patient, careful control had compressed into something that sounded like what it was covering. "I am not pitying you," she said. "I need you to hear that. I am not pitying you and I am not judging you. I am telling you that we need to look at those documents and we need to look at them together, and whatever they say, we are going to handle it. That is all." He was quiet for a long time. The mare shifted slightly, and he steadied her with a hand on her neck, and then he turned around and looked at Eliza in the lamplight. And what she saw on his face was not the careful, patient man she knew, but the person underneath that patience. The person the patience had been built to protect. And he looked exhausted in a way that had nothing to do with the day's work and everything to do with years and years of managing a hidden limitation in a world that ran on written language. "I should have told you," he said. "You tell me the things that need telling when they need to be told," she said. "That has been sufficient." He brought the documents out that evening. They sat at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up high, and Eliza read them aloud, slowly and fully, every word, every number, every piece of legal language about the land boundaries and the water rights and the filing dates, and Vernon listened with his eyes fixed on the table and his hands flat on the wood, and when she finished, she went back to the boundary description and read it again. "It is correct," she said. "The boundaries are correct. The language about the water rights is correct. The filing numbers match the official record book from the land office, which Gerald can request from Santa Fe if needed." She looked up. "Waverly's lawyer does not have a case." "You are certain?" "I am certain, but we should have copies made by someone official, a notary, and we should have them witnessed." She paused. "I can draft the request letter tomorrow." Vernon looked at her for a long time. "Eliza," he said. "It is our land," she said simply. "I am not going to let anyone take our land." He reached across the table and covered her hands with his, and it was the most deliberate, unhurried gesture, a gesture with no ambiguity and no hiding in it, and she turned her hands over under his and held on. They went to Cimarron the next morning together, and Eliza went to the dry goods store and into the back room where the Santa Fe lawyer had set up his temporary office. And she sat down across from him and put the documents on the table and told him, in the clear, precise language of a woman who knows exactly what she is doing, that the claim was properly filed, the boundaries were correctly recorded, and any challenge to the Maddox land rights would find itself facing a full legal response, including a formal request to the Territorial Land Office in Santa Fe for verification of all relevant records. The lawyer, whose name was Ashby and who had the look of a man who had been sent to do a job and was now reconsidering the terms of his employment, looked at the documents, looked at Eliza, and looked at the documents again. "Mrs. Maddox," he said carefully. "Mr. Ashby," she said, "I will convey your position to my client." "Please do," Eliza said, and collected the documents and stood up. Prescott Waverly left Cimarron by the end of July. He had other opportunities in other territories, and the Maddox claim was, as Ashby had apparently informed him, solid as the land itself. The threat dissolved the way bad weather dissolves over the mountains, into the west, into nothing. But something had shifted between Vernon and Eliza in the doing of this thing together, something more permanent than a legal victory. He had let her see him. He had shown her the hidden thing, the secret he had carried so carefully for so long, and she had taken it not as a weakness to be handled with pity or a deficiency to be noted with disappointment, but as a simple fact to be addressed with competence and shared purpose. And he had watched her walk into that lawyer's office with his land documents in her hands. And he had understood, with the particular clarity that comes only when you stop being afraid, that the woman he had married was extraordinary in ways he had not fully anticipated, and that his life was going to be immeasurably different for having her in it. He told her he loved her in September at the end of a day's work, standing in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands, which was where he stood when he was being courteous to something important. He said it directly, without preamble, in the same plain-spoken way he said everything. Eliza was at the stove. She had over the summer made measurable and legitimate progress on the cooking, and what she was making tonight was a proper beef stew, the real article, the dish that had defeated her in May and had become, through Maria's patient guidance and Eliza's relentless practice, something she could now produce with reasonable confidence. The smell in the kitchen was entirely promising. The potatoes were holding their shape. The beef was tender in the correct way, the way that means time and heat have worked together rather than against each other. She stirred the pot. "I love you too," she said. "I have for quite some time. I was waiting for you to say it first because I was afraid you might not, and I would rather have waited forever in doubt than said it and been wrong about what you felt." Vernon was quiet for a moment. "I would have said it sooner if I had known that." "You could not have known that," Eliza said. "I was quite determined not to show it." "You are not as hidden as you think you are," Vernon said. She looked at him over her shoulder. "How long have you known?" "Since the corn bread," he said, and the corner of his mouth moved in the way that she loved, the way she had always loved from the very beginning, the small, certain movement of a man who finds joy in particular things. "The corn bread," she said. "You were so careful not to be proud of it," he said, "but you were so proud of it. And I thought, if she is learning to cook for this kitchen, she is not planning to leave this kitchen, and if she is not planning to leave, then this is her home now and she has decided that. And if she has decided that, then she has decided on me, and if she has decided on me, then there is something in that decision that is not purely practical." Eliza turned back to the stove and stirred the stew. "You reasoned your way to I love you from corn bread," she said. "It was good corn bread," he said. She laughed. It was a real laugh, not the polite kind, not the social kind, the kind that comes from somewhere deep and genuine and cannot be performed. And Vernon came into the kitchen and stood beside her, and she leaned briefly against his shoulder, and they stood like that at the stove, together over the stew that was finally, actually, honestly good. And the evening came down outside the window, and the Cimarron Valley received the dark with its usual enormous grace. Autumn was red and gold in the cottonwoods, and the light went amber and long over the pastures, and Eliza Fletcher Maddox, as she had now begun to think of herself in full, entered her first real New Mexico winter with the particular confidence of a woman who has survived one frontier crisis already, and has decided that the landscape, however large, is not going to defeat her. She continued with the cooking. She was not and would never be the cook that Maria was, but she achieved a solid and respectable competence over the months that followed, a repertoire of dishes that could be produced reliably and were received with genuine appreciation. She still burned things occasionally. She still sometimes pushed too hard on the salt. She still had a difficult relationship with pastry that she suspected was mutual. But the disasters became exceptions rather than the rule, and the table at the Maddox Ranch became a place where good food appeared with some regularity, which was more than anyone had initially expected and considerably more than Eliza had promised. Vernon learned to read, though this was not something that happened as a single event, but as a long, private, patient process that Eliza managed with the same strategic casualness she brought to everything she genuinely wanted to succeed at. She did not frame it as teaching. She framed it as evenings. They read together in the evenings, at first with her reading aloud and him listening, and then with him following along in the text, and then gradually, over the course of winter and into the following spring, with him taking over sections and working through them in his slow, careful way while she sat beside him and did not hurry him and did not correct him unless he asked for correction. He read to her eventually, from one of the books she had brought from St. Louis. Not fluently, not quickly, but with the deliberate and concentrated attention he brought to everything that mattered to him, and Eliza sat beside him in the lamplight and listened to his voice read words she had read a dozen times and found that they sounded entirely new. Gerald Hollies, who visited in the winter with perhaps slightly less frequency now that the whiskey and the news were not required as pretexts, and he had acknowledged to himself that he simply liked coming to the Maddox ranch, because it was a pleasant place, and both the people in it were good company, observed on a Tuesday afternoon in January of 1879 that the place looked different than it had the previous year. "Better curtains," he said, looking around the main room. "Eliza made them," Vernon said. "The garden looks like someone has been tending it." "Eliza," Vernon said again. "You," Gerald said to Eliza, who was pouring coffee, "have done remarkable things with this house." "The house was worth doing remarkable things with," Eliza said. "It only needed attention." Gerald looked at them both, at the specific quality of the space between them, which had the dense, comfortable warmth of a space that two people have been occupying together for long enough that it has taken their shape. He accepted his coffee and sat in the chair that was already understood by everyone to be Gerald's chair when Gerald was present. "You two are going to be all right," he said, with the satisfied air of a man surveying the outcome of his own good judgment. "We had already reached that conclusion," Vernon said. "Independently," Eliza added. "And then together," Vernon said. Gerald drank his coffee and looked very pleased with himself. The news that Eliza was expecting came in March of 1879, on a day when the snow was still on the mountain peaks, but the valley floor had decided it was spring and was proceeding accordingly. She told Vernon in the kitchen, which was where most of the important conversations in their lives happened, and he looked at her with an expression that passed through several states before settling into something so unguarded and full that she had to look away for a moment, the way you look away from the sun. "When?" he said. "October, I think," she said. "I will go into Cimarron next week to see Dr. Hawthorne." He crossed the kitchen in 2 strides and held her, which was not his usual mode of communication, but which she received with her whole self, her arms going around his neck and her face against his shoulder. And they stayed like that for a long moment in the kitchen that had been the site of so many small disasters and so much quiet progress. And the spring light came through the window Eliza had hung curtains in, and the valley outside was going green, and everything was very still. Maria Reyes, when told, wept with a warmth and generosity that Eliza found deeply moving, and then produced from somewhere in her kitchen a rebozo that had belonged to her mother and which she pressed into Eliza's hands with the specific seriousness of a woman transferring something precious. "For the baby," she said. "Maria," Eliza said. "And for you," Maria said. "You will be a good mother. You are fierce enough." Eliza thought about this later, sitting in the afternoon light of the main room with her mending in her hands, and decided it was the best thing anyone had ever told her. The summer of 1879 was hot and full. The ranch work was heavy. The cattle herd had grown. There were new fences to be maintained along the south boundary, and Tobias Reyes had taken on a helper, a young Apache man named Lewis who had worked on several ranches in the area and came with excellent recommendations and a reserve that Eliza respected immediately. He worked hard and said little and treated the land with a quiet respect that went beyond the professional, and she thought sometimes, watching him work, about the complicated history of this land, what it had been before it was land claims and survey lines, and she felt the weight of that complexity without quite knowing what to do with it. And she decided that the least she could do was treat every person on it with the same honesty she wanted for herself. She made supper for the full group one Sunday in August, all 5 of them, herself and Vernon and Tobias and Maria and Louis, sitting around the table that was barely large enough and the extra chairs brought in from the main room, and she made the beef stew, her stew now, the one she had learned through catastrophe and persistence and Maria's patient hands, and she put it on the table and sat down and said nothing. It was good. It was genuinely, straightforwardly, reliably good. Not Maria-level good, not a thing of beauty or artistry, but solid and nourishing and full of flavor, the food of people who work hard and need to be fed well, and it was eaten with the clean efficiency of a table full of hungry people who find that the food justifies the hunger. "Mrs. Maddox," Louis said, which was the most words Eliza had heard him string together, "this is very good." "Thank you," Eliza said. "Better than last time," Tobias said, which was not precisely tactful but was entirely honest, and everyone at the table, including Eliza, laughed. Vernon looked at her across the table over the heads of the others with an expression that she now knew very well, had catalogued thoroughly, had filed in the deepest and most permanent section of the archive she kept of him. It was the expression that said several things at once, things that were not convenient to say at a table full of people, and did not need to be said because the expression itself was sufficient. She looked back with the expression that answered it, the one that said she understood and agreed and felt the same, and across the table full of food and people, and the particular crowded warmth of a good summer evening, they had a complete conversation without a word. Her son was born in the 3rd week of October 1879, in the bedroom that Eliza had made her own over the preceding year and a half, during a night that was long and difficult in the way births are, with Maria Reyes and Dr. Hawthorne in attendance, and Vernon in the main room doing what men in 1879 did during births, which was to wait with the controlled, rigid patience of a person being forced to be inactive in a crisis situation. He was a healthy boy, round and furious and demanding, with his father's dark hair, and Eliza thought his mother's expression when confronted with something that displeased him, which was an expression of severe, comprehensive judgment. They named him James Vernon Maddox, James for Eliza's father despite the complicated feelings that accompanied that name, and Vernon for his father, because Eliza had decided that a name worth having was worth passing down. Maria brought the baby to Vernon in the main room when the doctor gave permission, and Eliza, from the bedroom doorway, watched Vernon hold his son for the first time. She watched him look down at this new person in his arms with an expression that was entirely undefended, entirely without the patient, careful control of the public self, and it was the most private thing she had ever seen. This man she had crossed a continent to marry standing in the lamplight of the home they had built together, holding their son. And she thought that all of the burning and the boiling and the calcified beans and the ruined biscuits and every difficult and embarrassing thing she had ever attempted in that kitchen had been, in their way, the price of admission to exactly this, and it had been worth it, every ruined bite. She went asleep that night with James in the cradle Vernon had built, a solid, careful piece of work built out of pine from the mountains with the same unhurrying attention he brought to everything, and Vernon sitting in the chair beside the bed in the lamplight, because neither of them had suggested he leave and neither of them saw any reason why he should, and she thought she could hear, under the sound of the valley settling into night, the specific quiet that lives inside the word home. James Maddox was, from the beginning, a person with opinions. He had opinions about food, loudly expressed, about the schedule of the day, about the horse he was allowed to pet and the horse he was not, about the stories read to him in the evenings, which he preferred his father to read, a preference that made Vernon visibly and privately honored every single time. He learned to walk in the spring of 1880 with the purposeful, head-forward stride of a person who has already decided where they are going and is simply working out the mechanical requirements. And he spent that summer attached to his father's side in the way small children attach themselves to the person they have designated as the most interesting thing in the world. Eliza watched them in the afternoons, her son on his father's shoulders pointing at things on the horizon as if directing a survey, and she continued to build the life, the garden that was now genuinely productive, the house that was warm and lived in and full of the accumulated evidence of two people who had made a home out of honesty and stubbornness and beef stew. And she thought about what she had written in the letter from St. Louis, the sentence about not looking for romance. And she laughed at herself with the generous amusement of a woman who has been entirely and splendidly wrong about something. There was a second child 3 years after James, in the autumn of 1882, a girl they named Clara Maria Maddox, the middle name a decision Eliza had made without consulting Vernon, who had agreed immediately and completely, and Maria Reyes had wept again when she heard it, and Eliza had held her hand, and they had sat in the kitchen that smelled like good food and thought about the years that had gotten them here. Clara was different from James in every way, patient where he was relentless, quiet where he was declarative, interested in the small things, the detailed things, the way the light moved through the window glass, and the way the seeds in the kitchen garden were arranged before they went into the ground. She was Eliza's daughter in her hands, which were always busy with something, and she was Vernon's daughter in her eyes, which missed nothing. The ranch grew. By 1883, the Maddox place was one of the more substantial operations in the Cimarron Valley, expanded with a second grazing pasture acquired through legitimate purchase, and a small horse trading operation that Vernon had developed alongside the cattle, working with the native horse breeds of the territory, and building a reputation for quality that brought buyers from as far as Denver. Tobias Reyes had become a full partner in the horse operation, an arrangement made formal on paper and celebrated with a supper at the Maddox table that went on until nearly midnight. Gerald Holly sat at the far end of the table with his third glass of rye whiskey and looked at the assembled company with the peaceful satisfaction of a man in the presence of things he helped to set in motion. "You know," he said, addressing the room generally, "I wrote that advertisement." "We know, Gerald," Vernon said. "I think it was some of my best work." "It was 6 words," Eliza said. 14 words, Gerald corrected with the precision of a man who has counted. "And they were the right 14. Vernon reached across the table and took Eliza's hand, which was not something he did publicly with any frequency, and she looked at him, and he looked at her, and the table full of people and the lamplight and the food and the sound of James and Clara asleep in the back room all arranged themselves around that moment the way the land arranges itself around the river, orienting to what is most necessary. "The cooking helped," Vernon said. "The cooking was a disaster," Eliza said. "You said it was a disaster," Vernon said. "You said you could not cook anything worth eating. I said I would eat it anyway. You did say that. And I meant it." "I know," Eliza said. "I have always known." She had not known, not in the beginning. In the beginning it had seemed like stubbornness or bravado or possibly the social etiquette of a man who did not wish to wound a woman who was clearly already wounded by the fact of her own inadequacy. She had not understood until much later, until the lantern light and the ruined stew and the moment he walked around the table and stood in front of her and said those plain words, that what he had meant when he said he would eat it anyway was something much larger than supper. What he had meant was that he would take her as she was, limitations and all, that her imperfections were not obstacles to his regard, but simply part of what he was regarding, that he did not need her to be perfect at anything in order to want her there. This was the most radical thing anyone had ever offered her. It was more radical than love in the abstract, more radical than the ring on her finger or the words of a 6-minute ceremony. It was the specific offer of being known completely, the dark parts and the failing parts and the parts that turn beans into architecture, and being chosen anyway, deliberately, with full information. She had taken that offer. She had built a life inside it. She had learned to cook, not because she had to, but because she wanted to bring something good to the table where she had been so completely accepted. And she thought that the best relationships were probably built something like that. Not on the exchange of perfections, but on the patient accumulation of effort made for each other, the daily choice to try again. She told Vernon this one evening in the fall of 1883, sitting on the porch after the children were asleep, the mountains showing their silhouettes against a sky full of stars, so bright they seemed close enough to affect the conversation. They were drinking coffee, which had been one of the reliable constants of their life together, good coffee always, that she had learned to make well before she learned anything else. He was quiet for a while after she said it, in the way he was quiet when he was giving something its proper consideration. "You are right," he said, "but I would add something." "What?" "It was not patience on my part," he said, "not in the way you are describing it. I did not eat the burned food with the noble intention of teaching you that I accepted you. I ate it because I had decided you were worth every bad biscuit and everything else, and once I have decided something, I do not undecide it." Eliza looked out at the mountains. "You are a very stubborn man." "Yes," he said, "it has worked out well." She laughed, and the laughter went out into the night air of the Cimarron Valley and was absorbed by the enormous indifferent dark, which did not care about it at all, but she cared about it, and Vernon cared about it, and this was entirely sufficient. James turned 4 in October, and received from his father a small knife in a leather sheath, presented with the gravity of a man initiating a serious rite, and a set of instructions about its use that were delivered at length and with considerable solemnity, and were apparently so compelling that James repeated them, nearly verbatim, to Clara, who was not yet a year old, and received this wisdom with the tolerant expression of someone who is waiting for more interesting content. The winter of 1883 was hard. The kind of hard that the New Mexico Territory can produce when it decides to remind the people in it of their smallness, deep cold and snow that came early and stayed, weeks of it, the kind of weather that tests the quality of every preparation made in the warmer months. The Maddox ranch had been prepared well. The hay stores were sufficient. The cattle had been brought into the lower pastures before the worst of the cold. The house had been banked against the wind with the particular competence of people who know their winter and have learned to meet it. They spent those weeks close to home, close to the fire, the four of them in the house that Eliza had spent 2 years making into the kind of place that a hard winter could not diminish. She read to the children in the evenings. Vernon worked on the leather repairs that accumulated over a full year of ranch work and were best addressed in the enforced indoor time of winter. They played checkers after supper, and Vernon was extremely good at checkers in a way that made Eliza suspicious he had been practicing without her knowledge. And James, at 4, had decided that losing at checkers was a deeply personal offense that required immediate and articulate protest. There were evenings when the wind was hard against the house, and the fire was the only warmth for many miles in any direction, and the children were asleep, and Vernon and Eliza sat together in the fire-lit room with the snow coming down outside, and the quality of the silence between them in those hours was something Eliza had no language for and did not need to have language for. It was the silence of two people who have been honest with each other about every important thing, who have seen each other's limitations and chosen anyway, who have built a real thing together out of real materials, and who find in each other's company the specific and irreplaceable quality of being understood. She thought sometimes, in those winter evenings, about the woman who had written the letter from Mrs. Anstruther's boarding house in St. Louis, the woman who had laid out her inadequacies with the crisp directness of someone who has stopped hoping for approval and has decided that honesty is more useful. That woman had not known she was laying a foundation. She had thought she was simply being clear about the terms. She had not known that somewhere in Cimarron, New Mexico, a man was going to respond to her honesty with honesty of his own, was going to match her clarity with clarity, and that from this exchange, two people who had been somewhat alone in the world were going to build something that could hold through blizzards and legal threats and burned biscuits and everything else that the frontier and life could produce. She had said she could not cook anything worth eating. He had said he would eat it anyway, and meant it. And meaning it, she had come to understand, was the whole of it. Not the sentiment, but the meaning of it, the choosing of it daily, the waking up every morning and deciding again. The renewal of the intention, not out of obligation, but out of the genuine and ongoing recognition that the person across the table was worth more than any inconvenience or difficulty the table might produce. Spring came again, as it always did, aggressive and green into the dried browns of the Cimarron winter, and the kitchen garden put up new growth that Eliza tended with the experienced attention of a woman who has learned a new skill and intends to keep it. And the cattle came back into the far pastures, and Lewis and Tobias set the fence lines straight after the winter's distortions. And Vernon stood on the porch in the early morning with his coffee, and looked out at the land and looked at Eliza beside him with the expression that she kept in the deepest part of herself, the unguarded one, the one that required no translation. James was in the yard already, at an hour when children should by rights have still been asleep, attempting to teach Clara, who had recently learned to walk and found the enterprise thrilling beyond adequate expression, to follow him toward the barn. Clara was following with the enthusiastic incompetence of a person who is new to legs and finds each step a small miracle, and James was simultaneously supervising and narrating, and occasionally rescuing her from the ground, and the whole scene had the quality of something Eliza wanted to hold very still, to not breathe too hard around in case it moved. "We should have more children," Vernon said. Eliza looked at him. "You might lead with more notice next time." "I mean eventually," he said, "not specifically this morning." "Good," she said. He looked at her with the expression, "Though if you had thoughts on the matter." "I have thoughts," she said. "They are mostly affirmative thoughts." He took her hand, there on the porch in the morning light, with the children in the yard and the mountains showing their full height to the north and the cottonwoods along the river going their annual impossible green, and she held on in the way she had learned to hold on to good things, firmly and without apology. "I love you," he said. "I know," she said. "You ate the beans. You made the beans." "I destroyed the beans," she corrected. "You made them with intention," he said. "That is sufficient." She leaned against his shoulder, and the morning went on around them, and the valley was full of light. The third child came in 1885, another boy whom they named Robert Gerald Maddox, the middle name another piece of premeditated generosity that made Gerald Hollies, when informed of it, remove his hat and sit quietly for a moment in the way of a man receiving something he had not thought to ask for. "You did not have to do that," he said. "You wrote the advertisement," Eliza said. "It seems fair." Robert was from the beginning a different creature from his siblings, cheerful and easy in the way neither James nor Clara were, moving through the world with the rolling, uncomplicated happiness of a person for whom existence is fundamentally a pleasant proposition. He laughed readily. He accepted disappointment with a brevity that suggested he had already identified something more interesting to move on to. He ate everything put in front of him without complaint, a quality that Eliza noted with a warmth that contained multitudes. "He is going to be like you," she told Vernon. "He is nothing like me," Vernon said. "He eats everything without complaining," Eliza said. Vernon looked at his youngest son, who was currently investigating the taste of a wooden spoon with a thoroughness that would have impressed a scientist. "That is a different thing entirely." "Is it?" Eliza said. He thought about it. "No," he admitted. The years moved in the way that good years move, with the particular quality of time that is full rather than fast, filled to their edges with work and weather, and the changing of the children, and the steady deepening of a marriage that had begun as an honest arrangement, and had become, over time and intention, something much harder to name and much more valuable. They were not a romantic couple in the operatic sense, not demonstrative in company, not given to the grand gestures of people who are performing their love for an audience. Their love was a working love, visible in the small, consistent choices, in the fact that Vernon always filled her coffee cup before his own, in the fact that Eliza always left the lamp lit when he was late from the pastures, in the reading lessons that had become reading evenings that had become evenings where both of them read, side by side, companionably, in the quiet of a house where 3 children were asleep. By 1887, James was old enough to be genuinely useful on the ranch and deeply aware of this fact, and not shy about communicating it. He rode with his father on the cattle work and came home in the evenings covered in the same dust and wearing the same focused expression. And Eliza watched him across the supper table and thought about the man he was becoming and found, to her own surprise, that she was not afraid of the watching. She was glad of it. She was glad of every complicated, difficult, wonderful thing that had become her life. Clara learned to sew. She sat with her mother at the mending in the afternoons, with the concentrated patience she brought to small things, and produced stitches that at 8 years old were neater than Eliza's had been at 20. And Eliza taught her everything she knew about the work, everything she had taught herself in the boarding house in St. Louis, and everything she had learned since, all the things she was good at, all the things she had always been good at. And she watched her daughter's hands move over the fabric with the skill of someone discovering a natural capacity. And she thought that one of the better things you could give a child was the knowledge that what they were good at was worth being good at. She wrote to what remained of her family, a cousin in Cincinnati who sent occasional letters of variable warmth, and a former colleague from the seamstress work in St. Louis, who had married and moved to Chicago. She told them about the ranch and the children and the mountains and the valley. She told them about Vernon with the precise understatement of a woman who knows that the full truth of a thing is too large to put in a letter, that you can only indicate its shape. She wrote that she had made a good life, and that was not understatement at all. It was the most accurate thing she had ever put into language. In the fall of 1888, the Maddox Ranch celebrated its 10th anniversary with a gathering that Gerald Hollies organized without being asked, and would not be dissuaded from. A Sunday afternoon supper for the people of the valley, neighbors and cowhands and trading partners, and the Ray's family and a dozen others. Tables set out in the yard with the mountains showing their first autumn snowfall on the high peaks and the cottonwoods in their terminal blaze of gold. Eliza cooked. She cooked with Maria and with Gerald's wife, who had arrived from Ohio 2 years prior, and had the energy of a woman who had been saving it for exactly this kind of occasion. And they produced a supper that was abundant and good, and was consumed with the appreciative thoroughness of people who work hard and eat well when given the chance. Vernon stood at the edge of the gathering at the end of the evening, when the sun was going behind the mountains and the air was beginning to carry the real cold of autumn, and looked at his land and his house and his children running between the tables in the last light. And Eliza came and stood beside him, and they stood together watching it all the way you watch something that has cost you something true and is worth every bit of it. 10 years, she said. 10 years, he said. You have eaten a considerable amount of my cooking in 10 years. I have, he said. How much of it was genuinely worth eating in your honest assessment? He appeared to consider this seriously. About 60% in the first year, he said, rising to perhaps 80% in the second, currently somewhere around 95%. 95%, she said. The pie last Tuesday was in the remaining 5. The pie last Tuesday was a structural failure, Eliza said. Not a taste failure, the flavor was correct. The structure is part of the dish, he said. I will concede the point, she said, in the interest of accuracy. He put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and across the yard James had found Robert and Clara, and was organizing them into some game of his own devising that required running. And the mountains were going dark blue behind the gold of the cottonwoods. And the people in the yard were talking and laughing with the unremarked ease of people who know each other well. And everything that had been built over 10 years of honest work and patient choosing was visible in the quality of this evening. In the way the house held the light from the windows, in the way the land sat quietly under the people who loved it. "I am glad you said you would eat it anyway," Eliza said. "I am glad you wrote the letter," Vernon said. "I almost did not," she admitted. "I read the advertisement and I almost did not write back because I thought the truthful things I needed to say would disqualify me." "They were the reason I chose you," he said. She looked up at him. "The cooking confession. The honesty," he said. "The willingness to say, here is what I cannot do, here is what I am afraid of, here is the truth of me without decoration. I had never met a person who did that. I had not known to look for it." She was quiet for a moment, held against his shoulder, watching the evening settle over the valley. "We were lucky," she said, "to find each other." "Yes," he said. "And then we worked hard." "Both things," she agreed. "Both things," he said. The last of the light left the mountains, and the first stars appeared, and the voices of the people in the yard moved around them like water around something solid and good. And Eliza Fletcher Maddox stood in her husband's arms on the land they had made their own, in the life they had built from honesty and stubbornness and burned beans, and a single sentence that had meant everything from the moment it was written. And she felt, in the full and permanent way of a woman who has stopped being afraid of good things, that this was where she was supposed to be. The kitchen was waiting, with its good smells and its reliable lamp, and its worn table where important things were decided, and ordinary things happened in the same steady light. The children would be hungry again tomorrow morning, and she would cook for them, not perfectly but well, with the competent affection of a woman who has learned that the offering of food is one of the ways love makes itself physical in the world. And Vernon would eat what she made, as he always had, from the very first impossible biscuit to the most recent structural failure of a pie, with the unhurrying, unqualified intention of a man who had said a thing and meant it. She had said she could not cook anything worth eating. He had said he would eat it anyway. And in that simple, stubborn, entirely genuine exchange, a whole life had begun. It was, she thought, the best thing she had ever made.